Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel and to another episode in my do's and don'ts series. In this one, we're going to be focusing on do's and don'ts for drawing with coloured pencils because coloured pencil can be a really tricky medium to use. So this will be great for you guys that are beginners and want to learn some tips on how you can improve your drawings. And I'm going to be demonstrating this using a cupcake illustration. And here is the reference that I will be using and drawing from. But let's get straight into it with the first don't. And that is you don't want to use messy shading. You don't want to use a lot of pressure when you're building up your first layers. Instead, you want to keep your layers really light and you want to use circular motions to help get even shading. Now let's talk about that a little more in more detail, like I said, with the cupcake demonstration. So firstly, let's go through the don'ts. So when I'm shading in this cherry, I'm being very inconsistent with my pressure, so I'm going to have really harsh streaks showing through, which means that it's going to be really hard to add layers on top and get really smooth shading because everything's so inconsistent and I press too hard at the start, which means that it's just hard for more layers to stick to the paper. Also, one thing to mention is that my sketch is also too dark. If you have a really dark sketch, then it's going to show through your coloured pencil, especially in light areas. So just before I start my coloured pencil shading, I lighten up that sketch a bit with a kneaded eraser, and it just helps everything so much. So now let's go through some tips on how you can prevent doing messy shading. So one thing that I like to do is I actually like to hold my pencil a little bit further back, and I've really found that doing this helps me to keep my shading really light because you're not applying as much pressure to the actual pencil. If you hold it further towards the point, further towards the end of the pencil, then it actually means that you get darker streaks showing through because you are pressing a little bit harder, but holding it just a bit further back really helps to take some of that pressure off of the pencil. And you can see that I'm just going in very small circular motions. Now let's move on to the next don't, which is having very harsh transitions between colours. As you can see here, the difference between that blue and that pink is very abrupt. You can pretty much see that outline of where those two colours change. So instead, you want to make sure that your colour transitions are really nice and soft and that you're easing from one colour into the other by changing your pressure. So starting with a bit more pressure and then easing off the pressure where you want to transition colours. So let's go back to the cupcake drawing. One thing that I'm doing with this don't as well is that I'm shading in the whole of the frosting with a pink colour. You can see that I'm really not thinking about preserving any highlights, but we'll talk more about highlights a bit later on. For now, I want to focus on outlining, and that is something that I do a lot in this don't drawing, which is outlining. And I find that beginners do this a lot when I do my critique sessions on Patreon. I find that a lot of beginner artists with coloured pencils try to outline using darker colours. And I think the common misconception is adding outlines, you think it's going to make your drawing stand out more and look more realistic, when really it does have the opposite effect. Adding harsh outlines and harsh changes between colours makes your drawing look a lot more cartoony, and it makes it look flatter, which is against what you're trying to make it look like if you're trying to do realism. So make sure that you're avoiding outlining. Moving on to the do drawing, you'll see that I'm taking everything a lot slower and I'm being a lot lighter with my pencils, like I mentioned in the first do. And I start off with these shadowed colours and I get in the shadows first and I ease off the pressure where I want the shadow to fade away and turn into a mid-tone or a highlighted colour. So I'm never just adding harsh pressure with my, heavy pressure with my darker colours. I'm adding the most pressure where I want the darkest part of the shadow to be, and then I get lighter and lighter as I get further away from that shadow. And that's going to help to give you a really natural look, and it's going to make it look so much more realistic if you start to create softer transitions. And another thing that's going to make your drawings stand out more, instead of outlining, what will make them stand out is preserving highlights. So one thing that you'll notice I'm doing in this drawing is that I am not adding the lighter pink colour everywhere. I have left certain areas clear of any coloured pencil because these are the areas that are the brightest on the reference and they are highlights, and you want to make sure that you're preserving highlights and not shading in everywhere and just going in with your coloured pencil and just shading everywhere, because you want to have a good contrast in your drawing, and a contrast means having a range of values. You want to have highlights, you want to have midtones, and you want to have your shadows. So if you're going in and shading everywhere in with your base color, with your pink tone, then it's just going to decrease the contrast because you're not preserving those highlights. Instead, what I do is I leave certain areas clear of colored pencil, and then I go in with my white pencil and I just shade a bit of white over the highlights and on the edges where the white turns into the pink, just to soften out that transition. Now moving on to the next don't, which is don't limit the colours that you're using. You don't have to just use 1 or 2 colours. Instead, you can make your drawing look so much more vibrant and lifelike if you add in a couple more colours to hype up the saturation like I'm doing here. So I just added in a mid-tone colour of like this warmer brown, and you can see how much more vibrant it's made this little swatch look compared to when I just did a yellow and a darker brown. And those were the 3 colours that I used for my cupcake drawing. In the don't, I just used the 2 colours, and you can see even more sort of evidence that it doesn't look as vibrant in this drawing. So I just used the yellow ochre for the base of the cake sponge and used a dark brown to darken it up. And it looks fine. I got the contrast in, I've got the different values, but it just didn't look as vibrant and it didn't pop as much as it could, and it was just lacking a bit more colour. So I did decide to go in with a warm brown tone, and it just helps to lift everything up a lot more. And another sort of case where this would make sense is when you're drawing portraits. So you don't just want to use 1 or 2 colours for the skin tones. Skin has got loads of different variations and colours to them. And so if you watch people do colour pencil portrait drawings, you'll see that they layer loads of different colours to make it look really realistic. If you just use 1 flesh tone and then a darker shade to darken up the skin, it would just look flat and it wouldn't look like it had that healthy glow to the skin, and just adding in a few extra colours makes all of the difference. Another thing that you may notice that I'm doing more in this drawing is that I am utilising the value scale a lot more. So I briefly talked about this a minute ago, where with the cupcake frosting I said that it's important to add highlights, but it's also really important that you go down the other end of the scale and add in the really dark shadows as well. And with the don't drawing, when I did that cake sponge, I didn't get in the really intense shadow where the sponge goes behind that cupcake casing, that paper casing, whereas in the do drawing I went in with a black pencil and I darkened up that shadow. So really make sure that you're utilising the whole of the value scale. If you're unsure whether you've got your values the same as your reference, a really cool little trick is to just turn your drawing and your reference photo into black and white. So take a photo of your drawing whilst you're working in progress, and then use your reference, turn them both to black and white, and you can compare your values a lot easier. So in this do drawing, you can see that I'm preserving the highlights on the bow at the moment, and I'm also working on shading in at the start some of those shadows, just so I know where they are as well. It's important to start off with a clear vision of where the highlights and shadows are in your drawing. The next thing that I want to talk about is I see a lot of people when they're starting using colour pencils, when they want to darken up a colour, they just use black. Whereas this is not going to give you the most realistic look. Instead, go for a darker colour of the colour that you're using, or go for browns, darker blues, darker purples. They are much better at darkening up colours and making it look more natural than just going and shading in your shadows with more black. Especially if you are drawing a portrait, definitely don't use black to shade in more shadows and darken up areas. It will just make your portrait look very grey toned. Instead, like I said, stick to the neutral brown colours or a darker other colour that you're using. For example, with the pink, I used a darker pink to darken it up. As you can see here with this don't drawing, with this cupcake casing, I am just using the black to create those dark shadows. And it doesn't look realistic, it just looks like lines. I'm also doing the don't of outlining here, and you can just see that it has no depth to it. It doesn't look 3D at all. They don't look like shadows, it just looks like lines, and it looks like a colouring book sort of drawing. And that's definitely not what we're going for with this video. This is just, by the way, for realistic drawing. So if you're doing other art styles like cartoony drawing, then these tips may not apply to you as much. Well, not all of them, but this is for realistic drawing. Another thing that I'm doing with the Do is I am blending out my colored pencils, and I do this for a few reasons. Firstly, I want to get rid of the graininess, and that is the main reason. Having graininess with your drawings takes away from the realism so much, and it makes it look like a colored pencil drawing. So I like to go in and I use solvent. Specifically, I use the Zest It pencil blend, but you can use any sort of solvent, paint thinner, mineral spirit, Gamsol, something like that. You can even use something like nail polish remover to give this technique a try. And I go in with a cotton bud or a paintbrush as well, and I use this to blend and fuse all of my colored pencil pigment together. And like I said, I do that to get rid of the graininess, and I also do it to make the colours so much more vibrant. Now, another little tip that I want to give you guys is to make sure that your pencils are constantly sharp. It makes it so much easier to layer if you've got sharp pencils. And when you're shading with sharper pencils, your drawing looks a lot less grainy. For example, with this Don't drawing, I am using a very blunt blue pencil, and you can see that it's very grainy, and it's because when your pencil is blunt, the tip of the pencil can't get down into all of the dips and creases and valleys of the paper, so there's more white showing through, which gives it more of a grainy look. So that's just a quick tip, but it makes so much difference. Make sure that every few minutes you're sharpening your pencils, just one turn or two in the sharpener just to repoint it, and it will make everything look so much better. Now with this Do drawing, I did use the solvent and I let it dry, and I like to build up my drawings in layers. So that is another Do for you guys. If you want to make something look really 3D, then try and work in layers. And I like to go in and make sure that everything's nice and crisp and detailed and clear. And also I do like to check my contrast with my final layers. So this is where I really start to add in the shadows and the highlights to make everything pop. And this is something that I didn't do with the other drawing. I just left it as that other layer. I just did one layer everywhere and then called it a day. I didn't go in, add in these highlights or add in the shadows. And even if I wanted to go in and add shadows and highlights to that Don't drawing, it would have been very difficult because at the start I applied a lot of pressure to the paper. I really burnished the pencil into the paper, which means that it would be hard to add layers like highlights on top. And because I didn't blend it out, I'm not fusing those colours together like I did here. And when I added solvent to this drawing, it then makes it so much easier to add another layer on top. So I do recommend using solvent. It's one of my favourite ways to blend, and you can get a bottle of solvent really cheap. You can see that I'm adding highlights throughout the drawing, and I really am going over every single area. There's not one area on this drawing that I don't add more shading to, I don't add more contrast to. It's very important that you keep going over areas that you think you've finished and tweaking them and comparing your drawing to the reference image. Okay, so now we are coming to the end of this drawing and to this video. So I really hope you learnt some tips from this. And if you want to see how I created this cupcake drawing in real time, then this is over on my Patreon, the full drawing tutorial, and it is a beginner series that I made, so it's great for you guys that are starting off with colored pencil. I go through the layering, the blending, you know, building up layers, all of that, a lot more. On my Patreon, I've got loads of different tutorials. I've got over 300 on there now, all in real time. They all come with references, sketch outlines, and a materials list, and you can access everything for just a small amount per month. So I'll leave a link at the top of the description if you're interested in that. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you're new around here, and even tick that bell icon so you do get notified on my future videos. But that is it from me, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye everybody.